I know, it's a cheesy, overused effect, but I had to get it out of my system just once. So usually I'm not much for saber rattling because anything after the Renaissance is typically out of my wheelhouse and I'm not terribly interested in it, aside from Victorian fashion. Either way, these sabers are interesting because they fill a gap in the reproduction market, or rather a gaping hole. There are plenty of reproductions of 18th and 19th century military sabers, a lot of them quite affordable too, but historically accurate they ain't. LK Chen pretty much fixed that with these sabers. So let's take a closer look. I'll start out with the British 1796 light cavalry saber, which is the one I have more to say about, and I'll also talk about the 1860. These were both sent to me for free to review, so as usual, I'll make an effort to not let bias creep in and just tell you as it is. If you're interested in hearing about the historical background, I would recommend watching Matt Easton's videos about the 1796, which I'll link down below. Personally, I'm more interested in the practical hands-on side of things, so that's what I'll be focusing on: how it handles, how it performs, how I like it, and all of that. Now, of course, I have to talk about the originals to judge the historical accuracy. To make a reproduction sword that handles appropriately, of course, it's important to get the weight right. Historical originals varied a little bit. They tended to weigh between about 800 grams, although some weighed even less than that, to just under 1,000. So generally between a pound and 12 ounces and 2 pounds, 2 ounces. This one here weighs 953 grams or 2 pounds, 1.6 ounces. So falls perfectly within that historical range. Apparently, government-issued sabers for soldiers tended to be a little heavier than what officers would buy for themselves. The idea being, let's overbuild these a little bit so they can be abused by the grunts who may not take as good care of them. So I suppose this is more of a common man 1796. When comparing to historical 1796 pattern sabers, pictures that is, I haven't handled originals, you can see that the blade shape looks exactly right. Down to a very important detail, which is really more of a fundamental basic: the thickness. This is where most, if not all, other reproductions on the market drop the ball completely. Typically, they are the same length throughout. And you can see just how much of a distal taper there is. It's quite pronounced. And that makes a big difference for how it handles. Precise measurements of the blade thickness along the length are hard to find because most museum curators and private collectors don't do that. But there is an original that Nick Thomas has measured in detail. So it starts out with a thickness of 10.3 millimeters, which tapers down to 5.39 millimeters about halfway up the blade, and then 1.8 millimeters about 5 inches from the tip. So it's 7/16 of an inch, 3/16, and then 1/16. Right at the tip, it's even thinner than that. This reproduction starts out thinner at 7 millimeters, tapers at the same rate to 3.5, and then more slowly to 2 millimeters. So it's a 1/4 inch, 1/8 of an inch, and 1/16 of an inch, meaning that it's thinner throughout most of it, but then closer to the tip, it's the same as that original. Again, keep in mind, there's plenty of variability. So if you were to take, say, 100 original 1796 pattern sabers and measure them, you may see different numbers. So this seems appropriate. As a side note, the progression of the distal taper can also vary. Some military sabers stay mostly even in thickness throughout, but then taper pretty drastically in the last third, quarter, or even less. The hilt also looks exactly like the originals. Quite an effective design, really. It's very ergonomic, comfortable, gives you a good amount of traction. The only thing I personally don't like so much about it is this metal back strap here. It's not a problem, and LK Chen did it properly, so there are no sharp corners here. It's nothing uncomfortable. It's very smooth and properly polished. So there's really nothing wrong with it. I would just prefer if it wasn't there. I'm not sure what the intention behind is, probably just to reinforce it, which makes sense. The finish is great. Very smooth and even, and there are no significant flaws. Sure, you can always, if you look at things with an eagle eye, you can always spot some irregularities here and there, but it's all very superficial. And I wouldn't be surprised if the finish on this is better than most government-issued sabers, at least from the time. The same can be said about the blade. I have no complaints about the finish here at all. Crisp lines on the fuller, and it's nice and sharp. I really cannot complain about that. Again, might be sharper than some originals, not sure. but they did a great job here. All right, so handling. As I said, the grip is comfortable and secure. The balance is quite good for a blade of this size. It's very wide and obviously designed with cutting power in mind. Thrusting, not so much. You can do it, but it's not going to be as good. It is pretty nimble overall. I can't really show you too well because my right elbow is injured and my left arm is a lot slower and clumsier. Especially for a cavalry saber, this is more than adequate, where you don't need these really tight little wrist-powered cuts and lunges that you might see in a duel on foot. This way you ride past someone and lay into them. Cutting with it went well. It doesn't have mythical cutting power, but it does well for a single-handed sword. Of course, it's never going to be as powerful as a larger two-handed sword. There was always more challenge in maintaining good edge alignment with a single hand, but as long as you do your job well and don't throw it off during the cut, it does quite well. We had some struggles with lower quality tatami mats with substantial hardwood dowel inside. That was a bit much at times, but again, if you do your job well and you control the edge alignment and you put enough oomph into it, it will definitely cut all the way through. The higher quality tatami mats without core were no problem at all, and my current HEMA instructor, Zion Niles, performed some tight combat cuts without overswinging, and he seemed happy with the blade. Again, the saber would handle a lot worse if it was made of uniform thickness, even if it was the same weight. By the way, if you're wondering, the spine gets very thin toward the point, but it's not sharpened, so you can't cut with that. The scabbard is quite a hefty one, made of steel like the originals, and it fits the saber well. Now, it being made of steel, of course, you always have to be a little bit careful, because if you just yank it out of the scabbard without thinking, you might just dull the edge by grinding it against the steel. Now, interestingly, there's a picture of an original 1796 scabbard that shows it has a wood core, a wooden lining at least. This one does too, which surprised me. I wasn't expecting that. They could have easily made it an all steel construction, but clearly did their research and made it with a wooden lining. And just like the original, the wooden lining doesn't go all the way, which is kind of odd, right? I mean, even if it did, there is always this fitting at the mouth of the scabbard, which is made of metal. So even if it's all wood inside, there's still a risk of scraping the edge along that. So you have to be mindful of that either way. And with a lot of swords, I might point this out as a criticism that the scabbard might end up dulling the edge if you're not careful, but that's how the original was. It's accurate. So in other words, I don't have anything to complain about. Damn it. You know, especially when you do get a free review sample and you're like, I have to find something negative to prove that I'm not biased. Honestly, I can't. As I said, there are a couple of things that I would prefer personally if they were different, you know, like the backstrap and the way the scabbard is made, but the originals were like that. So it's accurate. I cannot fault it for anything, not the price either. In fact, for the quality, I would expect this to be much more expensive. This kind of quality, if I didn't know, I would guess probably like $600 at least, maybe even $700 or $800. So I would be a fool to not recommend this. And this pattern is quite popular in general. So if this is a kind of saber you like, and you're looking for a fully functional, historically accurate reproduction that doesn't drop the ball, there you go. I'm not even interested in cavalry sabers of that time period, but even so, I like it. Same goes for the American 1860 light cavalry saber that I'm liking more than I expected. Here's a seemingly ironic fact. The 1860 light cavalry saber replaced the 1840 heavy cavalry saber, which is the one known as the old wrist breaker. So want to take a guess what the wrist breaker weighed that soldiers complained about for being so clunky? Something crazy like 2 kilograms? No. 1.5? No. 1.1 or 2 pounds 7 ounces. The lighter successor weighed an astonishing 100 grams less, at a total of 2 pounds 3 ounces. You know what LK Chen's 1860 weighs on my scale? 1.09 kilograms, or 2 pounds 6.7 ounces. So pretty much the same as the wrist breaker. How's that? Well, What I mentioned earlier, they still taper. The mass distribution. You can have two sabers that weigh just about the same, and one feels really heavy and clunky and puts a strain on your wrist, and the other is just fine and dandy. Either that or American soldiers were a bunch of scrawny sissies. Who knows? Doubt that. The measurements of an original I could find were 9.3 millimeters thick at the hilt, 4.1 millimeters about halfway, and then 2.8 millimeters, 5 inches from the tip, which is 3/8 of an inch, 3/16, and 1/8. LK Chen's repro tapers from 8.5 to 4.5 to 3.2 millimeters, which is 5/16, 3/16, and 1/8. Even though the saber is slightly heavier and longer than the 1796, I find it just a little bit more nimble. It's not a great difference, but I feel like I can get slightly more of a pop. Why am I even doing this? My left hand is garbage. The grip is also quite ergonomic and effectively shaped. Comfortable with the exception of the wire, in my opinion, which is common on military sabers. And I suppose it's probably more suited for use with gloves. Not that it's a problem, like you're not going to get blisters from it unless you have really delicate hands. But the thing is, when I first got this, it actually arrived with the wire unraveled, which somehow happened during shipping. At least I'm assuming they didn't put it in the box like that. So that, by the way, also shows me that they did not cherry pick one as a review sample to make it extra nice and whatever. So I guess that's a good thing. On the new one, it's perfectly tight. And it's quite impressive just how closely they stuck to the original. All the details look exactly the same as the original. Highly accurate, which I very much appreciate. When I look at the tang you're being peened over, it looks a little rougher than this picture of an original. I don't know if they all generally look like that or if that's a particularly well-finished one. Either way, I don't see this as a problem. I've seen way worse, so this is totally fine in my book. And if you wanted to, you could take some sandpaper to it and make it smoother yourself. It's not a big deal. This one's also quite sharp and properly polished, well-shaped overall, but it didn't perform as well as the 1796, which, I mean, is to be expected because it's quite a bit narrower and it's not as focused on cutting. It will be better at thrusting. And yeah, we had some trouble with it getting through the tatami mats. Not just the problematic ones, but in general, it was noticeably more challenging to get clean cuts with the 1860. I don't doubt that it would be effective for its intended use because soldiers generally didn't ride into battle against the tatami mats. And I'm not sure exactly what made it so challenging. It can't be just the blade width because I have cut with similarly narrow blades that did a little better. So for whatever reason, the cutting performance wasn't impressive. I can't rule out user error entirely, even though my instructor gave it a try as well and didn't have much better luck. So whatever it is, the other one cuts better. The scabbard on the 1860 is not as good because it's too tight. You know, like it's, if you want to get it in all the way, I can't even really get it flush. And if I push it in that far, it requires a pretty firm tug to get it out. So it's a little bit too tight, and in this case, that can be due to humidity differences because it's not wood. I've read that metal scabbards from the mid-19th century onward didn't have any linings. I couldn't verify that claim as such, but I did find a picture of an original 1860 scabbard, which indeed has no lining, just like this one, and it looks the same. So again, high accuracy. So overall, well made. I don't have any complaints about it. And as I said, the wire, I actually prefer the one without the wire, just the way it feels personally, but it's perfectly tight. Again, the fit overall is excellent. And when I tested both of these sabers in terms of structural integrity, just doing some deflections, blade on blade, generally a spine on flat, no problem whatsoever. I want to see if anything were to loosen up, and completely rock solid, no concerns. And no significant damage to the blades either. You can see some wear on the spine here and there. Of course, you will get that from steel on steel contact. Also, now that I'm looking at it, it's quite impressive how precise they were when wrapping this, because the edge of the leather wrap is very straight. So they measured precisely, cut precisely, and made sure everything is even and tight. So great work. From someone who doesn't usually care all that much for 18th and 19th century sabers, these are excellent, especially the 1796. But if you like the 1860 pattern, that's money well spent. Those are both extremely well made, as I said, accurate, and I'm not aware of anything better on the market outside of much more expensive custom-made ones. So that's about it. Hope you found the review helpful. Thanks for watching and stay sharp.